Hi, this is Kosowski for AP Gov Review, and in part 4, we're going to be looking more at elections at the state level, and we're also going to be getting into the very controversial topic of campaign finance. So let's first start with state elections. They are, of course, very important at the state level, and in many ways, they are becoming more centered on the candidates, as we discussed in the previous lectures, as we saw with the presidential elections. And just like at the national level, at the state level, you can also have divided government in which you have a Senate and legislature that might be all Democrat, but at the same time, you might have a Republican governor, of course, being the quintessential idea of divided government. Now, typically elections are generally held in even numbered years, but there are cases where they are held on odd years, so it all is going to depend on the state itself. In addition, state elections are expensive, probably not as much as you'll see at the national level, but nevertheless, if the state is important enough, you will see a lot of money flowing in. Again, some states really are going to get a lot more money compared to other ones. So, for example, if you look in New Hampshire, $10.03 was spent per vote in New Hampshire versus just 278 in Washington state. But when you are at the state level, it again can vary on the state and how important your state is. So candidates can be on the hook for their own fundraising. You're not going to get as much support from the national political party, so it can be more difficult in that way. Now, state legislative elections into the assemblies, these state legislatures typically have small numbers of people who they represent and are probably really not all that known, even though you're at the local level. And it is similar, it does parallel in that respect to congressional elections. Maybe congressmen and women are known a little bit more, but especially at the state level, you don't see it all that much. Now, as we've talked about in other elections too, party identification, parties, candidates for governor and president have more of an impact on the race. Certainly, if you don't know who that person is, you might be more inclined to vote for that person because of the letter next to their name, being a D for Democrat or R for Republican, or maybe I for Independent. But one thing that's going to be very important about legislative elections is that the state districts have to be redrawn after the very important Supreme Court case that we talked about, Baker v. Carr, which specified one person, one vote, in which all districts have to be equal roughly in size, and that typically hovers around 600,000 people. But just like state elections and national elections, campaigns are getting more and more expensive and candidate-centered. Now, when we look at this, a lot of states do have divided government. Generally, there is higher turnover rate, which can lead to new policy ideas. So you can see change happen at a faster pace at a local level as opposed to a national level. It's easier to get things done because, again, you're working with a bunch of legislators within one state, which is much easier, especially if you're, let's say, a state like Rhode Island. You're very small, but you might, identify to the region that you live in, as opposed to Congress, which is made up of congressmen and women from 50 different states. A little bit harder to get some agreement on some sticky issues. Now, a lot of states do have forced turnover through term limits. However, in some cases, some states have what you call recall elections, and this is actually direct democracy in essence. If you don't like that particular person, you could recall that person, that elected official, before his or her term is up. And in many states, when that happens, you also get to choose who you want that candidate to be replaced with. This actually happened to Scott Walker in Wisconsin. However, that recall effort did fail. It is very, very difficult to recall a public official, but it does happen on occasion. Now, when we were talking about divided government, if you look in 2008, the balance of power, and while this might be a little outdated, it nevertheless will highlight the concept of divided government. Notice you don't see many states that are all one color. There are a few, such as North Dakota, Ohio, you have even New Jersey at this point. But a lot of states have divided government, where you might have the governor being Republican and the state Senate and House being Democratic. And this is very much characteristic of divided government. So it's not just something that happens at the national level, it also happens at the state level as well. But one thing about state elected officials, you're seeing male elected leaders going away as women and minorities are being elected at higher rates. As of 2008, 8 female state governors, which is one of the highest ratings in many, many years. And if you just compare this nationwide, certainly there's a lot more to be done. However, you don't have that many women necessarily running at the state level, as many are now going to be focusing their efforts at the national level. But again, if you look at female representation in state government, it is relatively low. You do have a few states that are above about 30%, but most are going to hover in the 11 to 20% range, despite the fact that women constitute 50% of the national populace. Now, in part 5, we're going to continue into elections and money. This is very, very important, and try not to be too bogged down in this. It can be a little sticky, but we'll get through it nevertheless. Something that you need to know is the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974, known as FECA. One of the important things it's going to do is establish the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. It will administer finance laws that we're going to talk about. It also is going to create the Presidential Election Campaign Fund, where 11% of taxpayers actually contribute $3 on their income tax return, in which an election would be publicly financed, meaning that you're not relying on private donations. And there are, of course, matching funds. Contributions of up to $250 are matched for candidates who meet certain conditions, such as limiting spending. So if a candidate does accept public financing, that candidate has to agree to not spend above a certain amount. Now, again, provided full public financing for major political party candidates in the general election does happen, but it does require full disclosure. You have to, of course, as part of the Federal Election Campaign Act, accept limited contributions. And one thing that you're going to need to know is something called hard money. That is any money given directly to a candidate. So if you make a donation to a political candidate, that is hard money. So real quickly, before we move on, when we look at the Presidential Election Campaign Fund, when you fill out your tax return, you'll notice down here, the next time you look, or you may not even be of age to do so, but there is a little spot note located right here where you see Presidential Election Campaign and $3 to go to this fund. Again, only 11%, so not a heck of a lot of people actually do it. All right, so dealing more with campaign spending limits. A very important Supreme Court case that you're definitely going to have to know is Buckley v. Valeo in 1976, in which the Supreme Court is going to rule that mandatory spending limits on one's own campaign violate free speech. So the idea is you can spend as much money as you want on your campaign. You're going to hear this sort of being a revolving theme, that money donated or just spent on your own constitutes speech, more symbolic speech, that is. So that is going to allow somebody to spend as much money as he or she wants on the campaign. And a good example of this being Ross Perot spending $60 million of his own money on his campaign. Now, one thing that's been somewhat controversial are things known as PACs. They are political action committees. They are the arms of labor unions, corporations, interest groups that collect and donate money to political parties and candidates. Now, there are limited contributions by FECA, $5,000 to candidate committee per election, $15,000 to any national party committee, or $5,000 annually to another PAC, and these have been around since 1944. For the APA Gov exam, you're not going to have to know the specific amounts. You will definitely need to know the limited contributions are set by FECA, and that PACs are, again, from labor unions, corporations, interest groups, etc. So definitely be aware of that, but I would not be so concerned about the actual amounts. Now, there is a use of soft money. Remember, we talked about hard money just before, where that's any money given directly to a candidate. In contrast, soft money is any money not given to a candidate, and there were no limits until 2002. Now, the caveat of a PAC is that they cannot have any coordination with a campaign. They can use, of course, the media to influence elections, which is going to help skirt FECA. So if you are a political action committee and you support candidate A, you can spend as much money on candidate A, basically, as long as you do not coordinate with candidate A's campaign. And hence, that is the use of soft money. So even though you're not really coordinating, in some ways you are, or sometimes they're former the PACs are former managers or people who have worked on the candidate's campaign, and they come over to a PAC after they leave. So there are ways to get around it. Now, one thing that comes about is the McCain-Feingold Act of 2002, which is also known as the BCRA, and that banned soft money, and it also increased the amount of individual contributions to 2000s and limited these issue ads. And it's going to ban PACs and corporations from running ads 30 days before elections, 60 days before a primary. Named contributions must be disclosed. And this was seen as a way just to limit the amount of influence that labor unions, corporations especially, are going to have in elections just due to the sheer amount of money that is spent. Now, PACs have grown significantly. As of 2006, you're looking at 4,200, and that number has gone significantly north of that. Now, PACs contributed over $372.1 million in 2006, and that was just to congressional candidates. So again, if you're a PAC, you're going to, of course, donate to candidates who support your specific issues. PACs do not technically buy candidates, but give to candidates who support them in the first place. So if you look at some of these big spending PACs, if you look at the National Association of Realtors, the amount that they're going to give, 52% to Republicans. The other 48%, of course, probably mainly to Democrats. So sometimes they hedge their bets. Sometimes they're going to be a little bit more slighted toward one party or the other. A good example, labor unions. Only 14% to Republicans because Democrats are seen as being more favorable there. So again, it is interesting where you see these PACs sending their money. Some, of course, for example, the National Beer Wholesalers seems to be a little bit more friendlier to the Republican Party as seen by this chart. Now, there are two important cases. Now, the first one is Citizens United. You should definitely know this. This basically says that political spending is a form of protected speech under the First Amendment. Basically, when you donate money to a candidate, that is a form of symbolic speech. Government cannot prohibit corporations or unions from spending money to support or denounce candidates. Corporations, unions still cannot donate directly to campaigns, but again, in the form of soft money, this allows it basically to be limitless. Citizens United and SpeechNow.org versus the FEC, of course, the Federal Election Committee. This is going to happen in tandem, and it leads to the creation of super PACs. And basically, they can raise unlimited sums of money from corporations, unions, and individuals to advocate for or against a candidate. Again, you cannot coordinate directly with political candidates, but again, this is going to open up the floodgates in terms of allowing money to be just pervasive throughout elections, both at the national and state levels. And that's going to basically turn the BCRA, or the McCain-Feingold Act, on its head. So just in sum, are campaigns too expensive? Well, fundraising definitely takes a lot of time. It's much easier if you're just going to receive it in forms of PACs and super PACs. Now, of course, incumbents are going to do worse when they spend more money because they need to spend to defeat quality challengers. And typically, PACs and super PACs are going to place their bets on incumbents. Why? Because incumbents have a 90% re-election rate when you look at the House of Representatives. Senate typically being around 80%. So typically, you're going to see them supporting the incumbents. And the doctrine of sufficiency suggests that candidates need just enough money to win, not necessarily more. All right, and let's do one review question. Take a moment to read it over. Pause your screen for a moment. All right, so in the 1976 case of Buckley v. Valeo, the Supreme Court ruled that, and if you chose A, the limitation on the amount of money people could contribute to their own election campaigns was not a violation of free speech and was constitutional, you are correct. So as a result, Buckley v. Valeo just allows one to spend as much money on your own election as you want, as evidenced by Ross Perot.